Welcome to our series where we are explaining terms, and this time we will be discussing conscience as a source of ethical guidance. It's not a term, it's a phrase, but again it's the phrase which is found mentioning in your UPSC syllabus. So let's start. Okay, now let's understand the definition of conscience. Conscience is an inward faculty or mode of judgment. Mode of judgment means that it is a way you're judging things, right? Mode of judgment, right? Through which a person examines, right? It's a way you are judging things through which you do what? You are judging or you examining the rightness or wrongness, whether it is right or is it wrong, right? Of action and holds self morally answerable. This is the most important phrase, and holds self morally answerable, and hence conscience, right? So it is just not judging things. It moves beyond, because the judgment that you pass with regards to whether it is right or wrong, whatever the outcome is, you will hold yourself morally responsible. And because you do that, because you hold yourself morally responsible, there another thing you get affected by, and that is crisis of conscience. Now let's understand what crisis of conscience is. Crisis of conscience occurs when an individual's deeply held moral beliefs clash with external demands, professional obligations, or societal pressures. So let's say that you are to decide, your conscience are to decide on the rightness and the wrongness of a particular thing, right? Now you decide that a particular thing is wrong, so you have to take action, you have to be morally, you have to be upright, because what it says that you are morally answerable, right? You have to say that no, this is wrong, but you cannot say that it is wrong. Because of what? Because of external demands, professional obligations, or societal pressure. It could be anything, but it is from outside, right? You cannot take a particular moral decision because you're facing this heat, you're facing this issue. And for that, what happens? You suffer from this particular ailment, this particular problem called crisis of conscience, right? Crisis of conscience. Now, this state is characterized by emotional, huge, because the moment, because you have taken it upon yourself to be morally responsible for the judgment that you are passing, right? Now, but the fact that you cannot pass that particular judgment, you cannot say that yes, this is wrong, and because this is very internal judgment you are doing, what happens? That you face profound emotional distress, anxiety, cognitive dissonance, these kind of issues that you face, right? Okay, now let's understand how conscience has been reflected by many moral thinkers, right? The first comes to our mind is Socrates. Now, Socrates uses the term daimonion, right? He uses the term daimonion. He uses the term daimonion. Now, daimonion is what? It is an internal voice which act as a restraint. It is an internal voice that act as a restraint from taking immoral action, or restrain him from acting in a morally wrong manner or a morally incorrect manner, right? So, according to Socrates, it daimonion presents conscience as an internal moral warning system. Whenever you are going to commit some wrong, it tells you like, please don't, right? So which is that particular concept which stops you? That is daimonion. So conscience here is related to a system which stops you from making wrong. Another of the philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, now he has a different take. Now what he says is this, that conscience is a practical moral reasoning, not a mystical faculty, right? It is a practical moral reasoning, not a mystical faculty. It's not something God gifted or it has come from heaven. No, it is precise moral reasoning, right? And a wrongly formed conscience can make mistakes. So here, the important thing that you have to understand is that conscience has to be cultured. It has to be built. A wrongly formed conscience, which is again your internal value system or internal guidance system, will like wrongly formed, it will choose incorrectly. Like you cannot choose the right and the wrong, right, properly. So here the focus is what? Emphasize that conscience must be educated and guided by reason, right? Conscience should not be like very emotional or should not be arbitrary. It should be guided by what? It should be guided by your education and guided by reason. The best example will be what? In this case, the best example will be Ashok Khemka, right? He cancelled a controversial land mutation transaction anchored in what? In legal reasoning. So my conscience is built on what? My conscience is built on this precise knowledge of legality, that this particular land transfer was wrong, right? And hence he has taken this particular decision, right? Now let's see another philosopher. So we have Joseph Butler. Now Joseph Butler says, conscience is a natural moral guide with authority over selfish desires, right? Now this is again an interesting take on conscience. So our selfish desires, focuses on choosing the wrong, right? Not the morally correct. But what does conscience do? Conscience is a naturally moral guide with authority, right? It acts as an authority, it acts as a guide, it acts as a monitoring figure over our desires so that we don't choose the incorrect option, right? So establish moral authority above personal interest. The best example will be what? Sanjeev Chaturvedi. Now what did he do? So he exposed corruption in the state government and aims despite harassment and career problems that he faced, right? Let's see another example of a philosopher, Immanuel Kant. What Immanuel Kant says that conscience functions like an inner moral court, right? If he says that it is a moral guide, moral authority, if your Butler, Joseph Butler says it's a moral guide, moral authority, right? Immanuel Kant says that conscience is what? It's your moral court, right? Conscience is your moral court that judges actions according to reason and duty. Kant is always associated with reason and duty, right? Okay, now let's understand some of the examples from Indian context. Our Mahatma Gandhi has said that, conscience is the small voice which has a higher authority than some external authority, like external structure. In this case, he was talking about the Britishers, right? He says that a still small voice within higher than external authority in moral matters. And best example in this particular case, that moral voice which is stronger than the highest of the high authority, outside authority, will be Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks had showed that defiance, right? When he refused to surrender her bus seat in segregated system. So in US, when there was a system of segregation where the whites and the blacks could not travel together, or could travel together but had separate seats, right? Segregated. So for black there were seats, different seats for the whites. So she refused to give a white seat, right? Because she personally, her moral conscience said what? That this is not right. Even the authority has set the rule. Segregation is a norm, segregation is a law. She refused it because, Because as Gandhiji has said, that still small voice within you says that no, this is not right. The moral conviction, the moral, direction, right, is always true when you're listening to your conscience, right? Then another example, again, where we see conscience being discussed when in Mahabharata, when Arjuna faced crisis of conscience, when personal attachment conflicted with his dharma, like he was fighting his brothers, he was fighting his family, but there was dharma on the other hand, that he had to fight them because it was his act of duty. It was his act to fight. He was a warrior. It was his Kshatriya dharma, right, to fight. Let's see some of the other examples. In case of contemporary integrity, right-based views, right? Here, conscience is linked to integrity, identity, conscientious objection. This is a very important thing, very important term, right? Conscientious objection, right? Now, what does it mean? That there is a rule, there is a law, but I object to that. The best example would be what? Best example would be Desmond Doss. So Desmond Doss, he participated in the World War II, but he refused to carry weapon. There's a very famous movie, Hacksaw Bridge, you can watch it. He refused to carry weapon because he was a conscientious objector to the war, right? He refused to carry weapon, but he did not shun from the duty of fighting, right? He did not shun from the duty of fighting, and he saved 75 soldiers at Hacksaw Bridge under enemy fire without weapon, right? Another example of conscience, right? And last but not least, you have your Nuremberg trials and Nuremberg principles, right? Now, what does your conscience say or conscience say when the state imposes a law and you find it unethical, right? Now, in this particular, particular trial, it said this, that principle 4 rejects I was only following orders where a moral choice was possible. Now, this is very important. Everybody in that particular Nuremberg trial said that, no, I don't know about, the moral correctness or incorrectness about the action that I did. We killed 6 million Jews, right? I'm not sure that whether what we did was wrong, because we were following orders. It was within the ambit of the administration, right? We were following the hierarchical orders. I had to accept it. But what does what does your Nuremberg trial principle 4 says? It says I was only following orders is not an excuse where a moral choice was possible. And here the moral choice was possible, right? A moral choice was possible because they knew that Jews were taken to concentration camp. The concentration camp were designed in such a manner in order to exterminate that particular race, right? Extinction of that particular race, right? They knew this very well. They knew this very well, they cannot escape from this particular excuse that I was following orders, because they had to make a moral choice, and the moral choice would, had they taken correctly, and many of them have taken such moral choices, right? Then they could have been reprieved. But one of the person who did not take such moral choice was, or moral decision was, Adolf Eichmann. So he argued that he was following orders from the higher ups, right? But he was the main architect of designing, such setup, such concentration camp. Of course, he was hanged to death. Now we will understand the legal, constitutional, and administrative context of conscience, right? Now it is very important to know that conscience is the inner court of moral scrutiny. That is important. Like, yes, it is, like, it helps us to take right decision. But when it comes to public life, now this is very important. When it comes to public life, it must operate under discipline of what? Number one, constitutional morality, public interest, and accountable procedure. You cannot take arbitrary decision because your conscience says that, this is right or wrong. When you are acting in public life, because in public life, your action has consequences. And because your action has consequences, you have to work within the domain of restraint. And what is the domain of restraint? It is your constitutional morality, public interest, and accountable, and to be accountable to procedures, right? And in Constitution we find the mention of conscience? Of course we find the mention of conscience. So in preamble it says what? It guarantees liberty of thought, belief, faith, and expression. Liberty of thought. Liberty of thought is what? Exercising your conscience, right? Then in Article 25 it recognizes freedom of conscience as a constitutional right. As a constitutional freedom of conscience. Just imagine, right? You have the right to be an atheist, because that is what your conscience says. Such a excellent, framing of our fundamental rights, that we have what? We have the freedom of conscience. We have the freedom of conscience, right? Subject to public order, morality, and health. Of course, as we discussed, it is disciplined by what? It is disciplined by what? It is disciplined by your public interest, constitutional morality, and procedures, accountable procedures. Okay. Now let's see. Now let's understand conscience with regards to administrative and legal basis, right? Now, according to All India Service and service conduct rules, you are to act how? You have to act in an integral manner, with integrity, with impartiality, with neutrality, right? Public interest based decisions, you have to make public interest decisions. But now this is very important, and it's mentioned in the rules. It says that the civil servants are expected to act according to their best judgment, right? They are expected to act based on their best judgment. Again, conscience, not blind implementation or blind obedience. We don't need blind obedience. And UPSC has asked this question, that in an organization and institution, discipline is a very good feature. Discipline is a very good value. But at times it becomes counterproductive, right? Because in discipline, when you're you're exercising discipline, you're not leaving much scope for what? Your conscience, because you're just following the rules and regulations, being objective, neutral, right? Being impartial. But you have to be conscious. So it's not just blind obedience. You have to use your better judgment. And of course, there are processes also, like when you use better judgment, you can document it, right? Because at the end, what you're doing for others' good, not your good, right? Others' good, right? Again, in institutional expression of conscience, oral orders must be recorded in writing, linking conscience with legality and accountability, as we discussed. Right? So whatever arbitrary or decision that you take based on your conscience, it has to be laid down by what? It has to be written down, so that next you are not questioned in your decision. So your whistleblower protection, so it came like around in the early part of 2020s, like 2014, right? Now, the exercising your conscience to, to know people about the corruption in the institution was legalized through this particular act. So Whistleblowers Protection Act is nothing but what? Nothing but institutionalizing the act of practicing your conscience. Remember, it is an act of institutionalizing, practicing your conscience. Very important, right? Again, there is no one such framework to make an ethical decision, right? But one can institute a mechanism to make an ethical, conscience-based decision making, right? So in this particular case, the conscience-centered approach to decision making, the first step is what? The first step is to verify facts and rules, right? Facts and rules are very important. You have to know the nitty-gritties of the case. You cannot just, make decision based, again, objectivity comes very first, right? You have to know the nitty-gritties of the case. Verify the facts, check the laws, rules and procedures, right? So act on what is legal and what is factual. Then what you do, you identify the stakeholders, right? So when you are identifying the stakeholders, always think from where? You think from the poor, the disenfranchised, right? From the people who are from the weaker section. Consider fairness. Here fairness, the value of fairness will come, right? Value of fairness will come, right? Act in the interest of the so-called, the poor people, the weaker section. The third step is to find that particular decision or that particular way forward, which is both ethical and is, constitutionally valid, right? So once that particular decision is made, you choose the best lawful, option, right? So again, evaluate the option against the consequences, right? What it can cause, what harm it can cause, right? Select the most proportionate and public interest based option, right? Again, you don't have to fear because it is based on what? It is based on constitutional provision. It is based on your conscience, your ethical values, right? And last but not least, and this is the most important thing, record and review. Record your decision in writing, that this is a reason that you have taken this particular decision. Now, you don't have to fear in taking such decisions because you're taking this from what? Again, you keep in mind, you're taking it from the understanding that you're helping the weakest section, right? And you are surrounding your decision based on what? You're testing your decision based on the constitutional value and the ethical value that you have, right? But in spite of these things, when you're taking the most moral, most important and most precise decision that you are taking, right? It is the decision that is based on what? It is decision that is based on the fact that it will have less consequences, right? And after that, when you have taken the decision, you write it down, right? You review the decision that you have taken. So the moment you have written it down, you have documented it, right? This is the classic case. What is happening is that you are practicing impersonal administration, right? You're not taking a decision based on your personal opinion. Now, let's see some of the quotes which are given by famous personalities. The first comes is Mahatma Gandhi. There is a higher court than court of justice, and that is a court of conscience. It supersedes all courts, right? As we have seen, right? It's just that small voice within you that gives you that moral superiority than any authority that is outside, right? And that is one of the best example where it will be your Rosa Parks. So she decided to, decided to oppose the segregation law because her moral conscience said that it is not right. Again, second quote is from Mahatma Gandhi. He says that in matters of conscience, the law of the majority has no place, right? Law of majority means what? The person who is instituting the social laws or the law of the land. But again, when it comes to conscience, right, it does not matter because that small voice within you will defy an incorrect law, will defy what? It will defy the morally incorrect provisions or legality, right? Then comes Martin Luther King, and he very funnily, he says, Never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, emphasizing that legality does not equate to morality, right? So legality and morality, again, UPSC might ask question, well, like what Hitler did, because he was the chancellor, right? He was the chancellor of Germany, right? A third Reich. So whatever he did within the bounds of law. But was it moral? Of course not. It was not. Then Albert Einstein says what? Never do anything against conscience, even if the state demands. Again, he was a sufferer of the anti-Jewish sentiments that started in the early 20s, and he moved first to US and then to first to UK and then to US, right? So he says that when it comes to like conscience, right, never do anything against conscience even if the state demands it. Resist, that is the most important. And most importantly, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn he's a novelist, he's a Russian novelist. He says what? Justice is conscience, not a personal conscience, but the conscience of the whole of humanity, right? Again, he brilliantly says that that justice can be equated with what? It can be equated with the conscience of entire humanity, right? Okay, now let's see some of the questions. Conscience is the inner voice that warns us when something is wrong. Examine the role of conscience in ethical decision making in public life, right? So in public life, we have seen, right, in public life, there were many instances where, it was because of conscience. For example, be it Rosa Parks, right, be it Martin Luther King, right, it is their conscience which had helped them to take important decisions, which again helped them in the public life.